As you've already heard by now, the pandemic has raised many questions for the church in North America, but it's also revealed both strengths and weaknesses of how we think about mission and church. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about how, in the long term, we may be moving from what has primarily been a church growth paradigm in church planting to what some are calling a city reaching paradigm, something that requires a long term commitment to city level collaboration. My friend and mentor, Dr. Bob Roberts Jr., he's been involved in planting hundreds of churches. And 12 years ago, I heard him tell a story for the first time, and it changed my thinking about church planting. One morning, Bob was praying, and he got to a city on a hill in a city, and he was looking over his city, and he looked at a church that was growing rapidly, but was being pastored by someone he knew was living in sin. And Bob was asking this question to himself: why not bless me, Lord, when this church over here is growing, and Bob's church was growing, but just was not the same size. And the Lord spoke to him. He says, instead of trying to be the largest church in the city, why not church the city? And that was the difference between addition and multiplication. It was the difference between pastoring a growing church in the city and being involved in a city-reaching movement. And the paradigm shift in Bob's life has happened in many other leaders' life. As a matter of fact, over the last 15 years, there's been an increasing pace of this paradigm shift. And I believe that the pandemic is actually fast-tracking this shift of paradigm. For some, it's been a natural journey from wanting to grow their church to wanting to be a part of a city-reaching movement. And getting to know these leaders more, the more that they're looking for is driven by one question typically. And that question usually sounds like this: what does it look like when the kingdom of God comes to our city? And in trying to answer this question, church leaders are realizing that it's not about their church, their tribe, their network. Answering this question requires not just knowing the condition of your church or your tribe, but knowing the condition of the church in the city. And then also knowing the condition of the city itself. That's what leads us to this point that in order for us to see city-reaching movements happen, we need city-level collaboration. Tim Keller wrote the foreword to a book that was released recently called Together for the City. And this is a book focused on city-level collaboration. And Dr. Keller makes this point pretty plainly. He says, while there is an increasing body of literature about church planting in general, there is almost nothing available that describes whole city collaboration among multiple denominations, networks, and movements. And this, I believe, could be the future of missiology in North America. The next iteration in our missiology, which needs to be reflected in our books, our church planting strategies, our implementation, should be driven not just by the church growth tactics that we've learned 50 years ago, but what we're learning about city reaching and city engagement now. And to say it another way, the proper context for seeing the growth of individual congregations should be a city reaching movement through city level collaboration. I wrote an article not too long ago about 3 basic motivations for building around city reaching and city level collaboration, and wanted to share them here. Motivation number 1 is this: unified mission to a city is an extremely important apologetic. You might say an unbelieving world doesn't care about denominations, so why would they care that denominations are coming together to plant churches? Multi-denominational church planting isn't a strict rational argument for Christianity, but it has subversive effects that will help the cause of the gospel over time in a city. Think about this. For the last 2 generations, denominational tribalism and disunity has been a cause for people to either be confused about Christianity or skeptical about the church as an institution because it's so fragmented. This is largely due to 2 reasons. Number 1, the last 2 generations saw the rapid decline of the Protestant church in North America, mainline, but also evangelical. And number 2, it's not uncommon for flagship denominational churches in a city to do what's best for them and to neglect what's best for the city. And for these 2 reasons, it's caused many non-Christians to distrust denominations and institutional Christianity. But if you understand this, that you should realize that much of the distrust that people have towards the church in North America is based on what is now becoming a declining Protestant church. It's not necessarily based against the growing kingdom-minded churches that at this time has been pretty subtle, but it's always been around and it's emerging today at a quicker rate. When you birth new churches for new generations that are city positive, kingdom minded, you're not only constructing a new Protestant narrative in North America, but you're also removing the power given to old arguments that say the church isn't unified. God is building a transcendent kingdom church, and multi-denominational church planting network collaboration is helping to usher that reality. Motivation number 2. A welcoming atmosphere is more conducive to church planting than a hostile one. This makes a lot of practical sense. Years ago, I moved to Canada to plant a church in downtown Toronto. The multi-denominational network in Toronto was still in its development stage, and our denominational's regional team was trying to stay afloat, planting a few dozen churches in the metro area that was 6.5 million people. The work was hard and the support very little, that if the pastor of a church plant in a community next to us told me, you should roll over and quit, I probably would have done that. But actually, these pastors didn't. Instead, one of them took our team under his wing and breathed life into us. He even sent people from his Presbyterian congregation to join our Baptist congregation. And later, as our church was getting off the ground and growing, a Mennonite Brethren network approached us, and we intentionally told them that we didn't want funding. They offered funding, and they were Mennonite Brethren. We were Baptist. They offered us funding. We said we didn't want funding. Instead, we wanted camaraderie in the city, and we'd be willing to come alongside their vision and their planters if it meant creating more room for other church planters in the city. A welcoming environment is more conducive to new church planters and new forms of churches than a hostile environment. So planning in a place like downtown Toronto was difficult and very slow at times, but the multi-denominational camaraderie and welcoming was a part of what kept us in the game. And because we received this welcome, we wanted to provide it to other churches and church planters as well. Motivation number 3. Denominations refine and rediscover their missional roots. Older networks refine and rediscover their missional roots. A funny thing happens when you tell your church planters that they're allowed to play with other tribes and networks. Your church planters become savvier in their leadership and culture. They end up having a bigger picture of what God is doing outside of their own ministry, outside of their own tribe. And every considerate church planter will want to take what they've learned and share it with their own tribe. It's the communitas that Alan Hirsch talks about in his book, The Forgotten Ways. It's the brotherhood and sisterhood and the familyhood that leaves their tribe, and it's birthed out of adventure with others, birthed out of challenge and mission, and then they return home offering something new and fresh to their own people. And it's been my experience that the best church planters honor their denominational roots. They study history in order to better understand the present. They know that they stand on the shoulders of many other women and men. They acknowledge the weaknesses and shortcomings, sometimes embarrassments of their tradition, but they also build on top of what historically has been passionate, albeit imperfect, movement kingdoms of God. And so what church planters learn outside of their denomination is often brought back to create positive change within their own tribe. I think these 3 motivations are just surface level reasons to consider city level collaboration for the long term. But if we pursue them and for other reasons, we can advance our missiology just beyond church growth tactics, which are important and helpful, but they happen in a context. We can advance those tactics to city reaching movement dynamics. We know that the rate of church planting today is not enough to keep up with church closures and population growth. For every year, we don't see movement dynamics happening in our cities. We are increasing the burden for the next generation to figure it out for themselves. So in some ways, our desire and ability to change the paradigm right now is a justice issue. The more we do now, the less they can do later. The less we do now, the more they have to do later. It's our responsibility to improve the paradigm now so that the next generation has a shot at Movement, reaching their generation with the gospel of Jesus and the kingdom. God is using this pandemic to speak to church leaders about change. My prayer is that we'll respond quickly in joyful obedience to what God is doing right now, but also into the future. God bless you.